All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this webinar on road mapping the next generation 911 transition, readiness deep dive. This presentation is part of our ongoing education series on behalf of the Emergency Services Working Group, or ESWIG for short. Really briefly, ESWIG is a group of volunteers from industry, public safety, telcos and others who are looking at the operational and technical issues around 911 and specifically the planning and implementation of next generation 911. I'm David Hamilton, Public Safety Industry Manager at Esri Canada. I'm based in Vancouver, and I'm presenting today with my colleague, Barry Costello. He's Next Generation 911 Readiness Consultant for Esri Canada. He's based in the Toronto region. We're recording this webinar, so if you need to leave before it's done, you can check out the recording. A link to the recording will be sent once it's available. And when you leave the webinar, please be sure to let us know your thoughts, especially how awesome the presenters were. Seem to be stuck here. 1 second. There we go. If you have any questions about the content we're presenting, please use the Q&A panel. Be sure to choose to ask all panelists. Type in your question in the box and click send. We will look to answer your questions at the end, but please feel free to type in your question at any time. Okay, the 911 community is facing a critical and pivotal moment in its history. The move to next generation 911 is pretty much a rebuild of its infrastructure from the ground up, and GIS is really critical in its success. This rebuild will impact most areas of your municipal operations, not just emergency services. For the next 45 minutes or so, we hope to, or we will explore what NG9 will mean to municipal operations beyond public safety and emergency services, and how these departments can prepare for the upcoming changes. Ultimately, we hope to both inform you and motivate you to take action to be ready. We're right in the middle of introductions right now, and following that, I'll jump into why next generation 911 is needed. Then I'll do a piece on next generation 911 and GIS. Barry will take over from there and do impacts and considerations for governments and talk about readiness assessments. And then I'll finish up with closing and moderate the question period. So why next generation 911? So I'm going to kick things off by telling you a bit of a story. This happened in the States, but there are similar examples here in Canada and really around the world. Chanel Anderson was out delivering papers late at night using her car, and unfortunately wasn't paying attention to where she was driving and ended up driving into a lake. She was stuck in her car as it was filling up with water. Chanel phoned 911 from her cell phone and provided the cross streets to her location. Unfortunately, her call was picked up and transmitted through a cell tower that was located outside the jurisdiction she was calling from. The 911 system used the cell tower's location and routed her 911 call to a neighboring 911 call center, or a PSAP, Public Safety Answering Point. That 911 call center did not have the street or address ranges for the area Chanel was calling from. The dispatcher tried numerous times to figure out where Chanel was calling from using cross streets, zip codes, place names, etc., but was unable to determine her actual location. The dispatcher listened to Chanel say her last words and take her last breath. Chanel died 20 minutes before emergency services was able to locate her in her vehicle. And like I said, there are many examples highlighting the need to improve location technology for wireless 911 calls. And unfortunately, all too often, the inability to locate the caller ends in tragedy. So what's the problem? The current E911 infrastructure is based on decades-old analog technology. It worked well for wireline or landline based calls from phones that were installed and associated with a fixed address. A wireline call to 911 uses what's referred to as the PSTN, or the public switched telephone network, and hits a selective router, which then kicks off a number of queries. The first of which is ANI, which stands for Automatic Number Identifier, which identifies the caller's phone number. That phone number is then passed to a second query called ALI, which is Automatic Location Identifier, and that identifies the address associated to that particular phone number. That address is then passed to another query against what's called the Master Street Address Guide, or MSAG for short. The MSAG is a listing of all the road names and associated address ranges within a given area. Each address range in the MSAG is assigned what's called an ESN, Emergency Service Number, which has two functions. It identifies the corresponding public safety answering point, PSAP, along with their responding police, fire, and ambulance agencies for each address range. All that information, the phone number, the address, the PSAP, the responding agencies, is then passed to the selective router, then routes that call to the respective public safety answering point, PSAP. Again, this process works tremendously well for those intended wireline 911 calls. However, that's not the case for 911 calls coming from wireless devices, where of course the wireless device is not stationary and therefore not assigned to a fixed address. There are two types of wireless 911, and that's phase 1 and phase 2 wireless. Phase 1 enabled the wireless carrier to connect the emergency call to a PSAP that serves the area of the cell phone tower that was calling the wireless, or that was the calling wireless device is connected to. So typically, as was in the case of Chanel's 911 call, the cell tower's location is used to determine where that call is coming from. Phase 2 wireless provides an enhanced capability to identify the approximate location of wireless 911 callers, and is enabled by two technologies. First being GPS and assisted GPS, and or triangulation. And they are used to identify a 911 caller's approximate location, generally between 50 and 300 meters of the actual wireless device. The emergency call and the caller's approximate location are then automatically transmitted to a PSAP serving that area. So really what we have here is we've got band-aided solutions for wireless technology that's placed upon this decades-old analog 911 technology. And when you take into consideration that over 80% of all calls to 911 right now are coming from wireless devices, next generation 911 and the improved location capabilities that are part of it cannot come fast enough. So there's an obvious need for change. You know, I'm talking about obsolete, decades-old analog technology where call location is based on the address of the landline or the wire line. But it's also about public expectations as well. So the public's expectation is that 911 knows where you are. The public is used to the experiences of Skip the Dishes, of Uber, of DoorDash. Those organizations, those companies know exactly where you are. And the public wants the same from 911. They want accuracy and they want currency. They want location by physical address or by device location, device coordinates. They want media agnostic. They want be able to call from a landline or a mobile phone or an IP address and still get through to 911, and 911 still know where they are. They want to be able to send text. They want to be able to send video. They want to be able to send pictures to 911. So I said it before, the move to next generation 911 is really a complete rebuild of the 911 infrastructure and processes. And it's a funny saying, but next generation 911 is really the biggest fundamental change in 911 since the invention of the telephone. It is literally ground up rebuild. So the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission, CRTC, back in 2017, directed all telephone and mobile wireless companies to update their networks to an IP-based infrastructure to be ready for next generation 911 services. Which then takes us to next generation 911 and the role GIS will play. So really, it's just to the rescue. The tabular hard-coded tables of the NEALI and the MSAG that I spoke of earlier will be phased out, and replacing those will be true point and polygon geoprocessing, leveraging authoritative GIS data to both locate the caller and locate the emergency, because they can be different locations, and to route the calls to the appropriate PSAP. So, you know, NG911 is really a paradigm shift when we're looking at that point in polygon processing, and really your GIS data will be necessary to make that happen. So you got to really ask yourself: is your GIS data make the grade as public safety data? And when I talk about authoritative data, there've got to be obviously providers of that authoritative data, and it's going to rest mostly on local governments. They're going to be the ones carrying the load here. So, but really, authoritative data can come from all levels of government, from local right through regions, provinces, federal, and certainly First Nations as well. But also from what we call owners and operators, and those are organizations that manage activities on large tracts of land. So we're talking about NGOs. We're talking the likes of CN Rail and Bruce Power. So those will be certainly organizations that will be providing data for and to 911 location validation, call routing. And then you got data users. So the NG911 network providers, there are 3 in Canada that are going to be providing the core services to next generation 911. You've got TELUS, SaskTel, and Bell are the three main players there. They're what we refer to in the next generation 911 world as EZNet providers, emergency services IP network providers. And then you've got PSAPs, public safety answering points. They'll certainly use the data for dispatch purposes, owners and operators likewise. And then you've got your first responders that will be using the data in numerous ways, obviously as routing the call to, or the units to the call, but also for other purposes as well, analysis, etc. So when I talk about data, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the NENA standard for next generation 911 GIS data model, specifically what they have to say about content, currency, and accuracy. So what you see here is it's what referred to as the required data. So NENA's chunked up the data model layers into 3 categories: required, strongly required, and recommended. All 3 are going to be necessary, certainly necessary in a computer-aided dispatch tactical map display world, but these required ones are required for that back-end location validation and emergency call routing functions, that point and polygon process in the back end to determine where the caller is calling from and to route the call to the appropriate PSAP. So road center lines, that's nothing really new for certainly for PSAPs and being able to use that data for their tactical map displays and for CAD. But also what's relatively new in the CAD world is address points, so straight structure address points. That layer needs to exist presently for next generation 911, but it can be empty because not many organizations or governments can provide a complete set of structure address points at this time. Yeah, that's the site structure address points. Then we got PSAP boundaries and emergency service boundaries for police, fire, and ambulance, and then provisioning boundary. So those are the required layers for that call routing function and location validation. And then you've got referred to as strongly recommended. They can assist in that back-end location validation and call routing functions in determining where the caller is coming from. So street name aliases, provinces, counties, etc. for a number of boundaries. Again, those are strongly recommended. And then you've got the recommended, and those are primarily just will be used for tactical map displays in dispatch. So adding context to the map, if you will. So road center line or railroad center lines, hydrography, mile markers, trails, the list goes on and on. That's just only a short list of what really dispatchers need in their tactical map display. So data goals. GIS data goals for next generation 911. I've talked about the content, that content that in the previous slides. We're talking about location validation and call routing to the appropriate PSAP, but also again that dispatch routing and the management of the 911 call from a dispatch perspective. We're looking at 98% data accuracy in those cases. And in terms of currency, this is a lofty goal, or some might say aspirational goal. But NENA recommends, excuse me, a 72-hour update cycle. So what they mean by that is essentially when an address change happens at the municipal level, that change is reflected in the 911 ecosystem within 72 hours. And again, that's a lofty or aspirational goal, but certainly one that we'll be trying to hit. And in terms of accuracy, we're looking at a 1 to 5,000 scale, a 4-meter horizontal, and 95% confidence. So needless to say, hope you get the hint, but it's all about the data. GIS data is mission critical to the success for next generation 911. And that's literally words taken out of the NENA GIS data model. It's absolutely critical. So that means there's an underlying message there that GIS professionals are now becoming geospatial first responders due to that critical nature of GIS in next generation 911. Because really, again, and next generation 911 requires that public safety grade GIS data. So a little bit on timelines here for the implementation of next generation 911. Of March 30th this year, the voice network by the EZNet providers needed to be ready. Again, March 30th of this year. Then real-time text will be ready same date next year, 2022. And then decommissioning of the current E911 network, March 30th of 2024. Now, there's an asterisk on timelines at the top there. There's a little statement at the bottom. These timelines will likely change. Therefore, I do have a caveat slide to go over with you here. So really what this is saying is due to the pandemic, the timelines that I showed on the previous slide will likely change. We will see a final decision on implementation timelines from the CRTC sometime in this quarter, Q2 of this year. We anticipate the change anticipate the changes to both the start and the end dates. But again, the urgency is still there. We need to move to action, and that is really upon us all to be ready for next generation 911. And I think the next slide, yep, that's my transition over to Barry. He's going to take it here for a chunk of the rest of the presentation. Over to you, Barry.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So Dave gave you the background on why next generation 911 is needed and the consideration for GIS data in the NG911 system, as well as the timeline. So that translates down into the impacts for governments, and specifically the majority of the impacts will be faced by the municipal governments in Canada. So Dave spoke a little bit about, or he mentioned several times, the public safety grade GIS data. And we can almost take that one step further and think of it as a 911 information infrastructure. And if you do any searches on what an information infrastructure is, it's a component of things which are people, processes, procedures, tools, facilities, and technologies that support the creation, use, transportation, storage, and destruction or maintenance of data, which service specific users. And in the case of a 911 information infrastructure, those users are there to link the caller to the PSAP, the public safety answering point. It's there to confirm the location and to assist in the dispatch of responders. So that's what we're facing now, as opposed to the way the system works today, where organizations on the response side, the PSAPs, even the telephone companies, and the PSAPs and the responders are using whatever data they can get. So the game is changing a little bit now. And what it really means to the municipality is that you're going to see increased stakeholder engagement, especially in the transition, whenever you're transitioning your current GIS data infrastructure into that 911 information infrastructure. And that's really where the PSAPs and the responders begin to have a relationship with the creators. And the creators of the data are those departments in the municipality that are responsible for the creation of an address or approving an address on a subdivision plan and approving the road layout in those mandatory layers. So your fire department is going to be talking to the planning department, and they're going to be saying, this is what we need, this is how we need it, and this is what the specifications are calling for. So you're going to have increased stakeholder engagement where the life of the data and the use of the data is much broader than the original intent of the creators. You'll also start to see third-party requirements coming into the mix that will begin to disrupt your operations, or at least will be disruptive in the transition. And Dave mentioned the NINA data model, which is really a data model, a schema model, data specifications for content, currency, accuracy, coverage, those types of things, as well as data quality, coverage, completeness, topological correctness, and accuracy. And then you're also going to be faced with, or another third party will be involved to a certain extent with you, and that's the concept of an aggregator. So your local municipal data has to be aggregated up into a provincial coverage and ultimately a national coverage. And so there's going to be a relationship that gets developed between the municipality and the aggregator in terms of update cycles, changes, and issue resolution. As a user will report an issue, that comes back to the maybe the GIS or the geomatics department, which goes back to the creator, and that issue has to be resolved and propagated back through the municipal database, back to those PSAPs, and back to the aggregator. So that whole process is going to include changes to how you manage your information. So I mentioned issues, mentioned synchronizing update cycles. David mentioned the 72-hour change goal that NINA has. And in some cases, those update cycles in the real world are up to a year old in certain situations. There'll be performance objectives for your staff in terms of being able to understand that the data that is created today, for instance, for planning purposes, is now actually used to help save lives. And so there are going to be, you're likely going to have to put in place new standard operating procedures, new performance objectives for staff and for management to make sure that those changes don't get lost in the process and they follow through right to the PSAP itself. And then you're going to have to develop data and data management issues to take data out of your existing schema, build or acquire or use ETLs to process the data out to the NINA data model specification that would then be consumed by the aggregator and by the PSAPs. What was interesting is that the first exercise that we went through in understanding what a municipality has today vis-a-vis what NENA and what Next Generation 911 is requiring. In the city of Guelph, that was our first project that we worked on, and it was interesting that the system worked. The data found its way from the planning department to the fire department and the police department, and ultimately to the Ministry of Health here in Ontario to dispatch ambulances. But what was really surprising to everybody went in thinking, yeah, we'll have to look at the data and change the data. But what was really surprising was the number, according to Alex, this is his quote, the number of informal relationships that were required to make things happen was a surprise. What really happened was the system worked, but it was all based on personal relationships that existed between the planning department, the GIS group, and those end users, where if an end user found a problem, they knew who to call in the GIS department to say, hey, there's a goofy address here, can you fix it? That technologist said, yep, I'll put it on my list of things to do. He or she did it. Maybe went back and talked to planning to confirm what the issue was and to get an approval of a change. And then on the next release or the next update, that was sent back to the police or fire department so that it was in their database. All very informal, worked, but nobody was really sure when that change had taken place, when that issue was resolved, and whether that resolution was actually in the next update. So we started a process of talking about NG911 readiness assessments, and from our perspective, there's three objectives in the readiness assessment. The first is obviously to learn about NG911 because maybe your planning department hasn't heard of Next Generation 911, or your executives in your organization have not heard about NG911. The police and fire department likely have, because they've had to make investments in technology infrastructure to accommodate the IP network that's going in. But the creators, the custodians, and the end users have to learn a little bit about what the GIS requirements are for NG911, as well as the executive in the organization, and the decision makers and managers have to understand what the GIS data requirements NG911 are bringing to the organization. Second thing you have to look at is understanding your data. There are NG911 schema and content objectives, quality requirements, and end user requirements. And those have to be fully understood as to where you sit today against where NG911 is asking you to be. And that image on the right is a graphical depiction of how information flows in the city of Guelph. So you've got to look at your how information is managed in the organization to make sure that that even if you've cleaned up the data, you've assessed the data and you're making improvements to it, you have to be able to maintain that data. So so there's a fair emphasis on making sure that your GIS information infrastructure or your information management processes are up to the task of meeting the NENA objectives and maintaining the data that you have, that you're going to be creating for it. So the readiness assessments, this can be a do-it-yourself activity, or it can be a purchase service, but you'll have to go through pretty well the same process. And the first part is discovery, and how we've approached it is there's a kickoff workshop in the study where we actually bring planning, police, fire, GIS, EMO, others all to the table and into a room, and we start talking about how information is created, how it flows through the organization, how those end users, the police department or the fire department or the EMS people, use that data, what issues they're finding with the data, what they would like to see in the data, and trying to get them to understand how the GIS data and the NENA requirements will work in their organization. That's followed on with Discovery continues with interviews and document reviews. And then, of course, we look at the GIS data to compare the data and the data model that's in use in the municipality against that NINA standard. That discovery process leads into an analysis and assessment activity where the database model and schema is reviewed. We sample the data looking for errors and omissions, coverage, content, structures, those types of things. We look at the information management practices that are in place, and I'll talk about them a little bit more in the next slide coming up. And then through that process, we also look at try to assess the level of corporate commitment there is to corporate commitment and understanding, I should say, with respect to ensuring that the data in the municipality is of a quality and is able to meet the next generation 911 standards that are being implemented across the country. That's followed by taking that information together and preparing a report that includes challenges and recommendations and assessments on the data model, the data quality and content, how the information is managed in the organization, and making recommendations and identifying challenges with respect to making sure that there's corporate support to make any transition from today to the NG standard and make it as painless as possible for the organization. So the assessment deliverables include, I mentioned the data model comparison. Excuse me, I'm just going to cough for a second. So sorry, there's the data model comparison, which is basically comparison of the NINA schema with your schema. Data quality, we look for errors and omissions. The information management processes, procedures, and technology. And the corporate understanding of how well that organization understands and is able to support the transition of the GIS, base GIS data to a 911 information infrastructure. So in the data model comparison, it's actually a field by field comparison of the NINA field in the NINA specification with the field, if we can find it, in the municipal data model. So for instance, we'll try to look for a from address left and a to address left, et cetera, et cetera. So we look for those fields. When we're going through that process, we score the level of confidence we have in that we've made a match. So that colored table up on the right of this image shows you the criteria that we use to assess the match. So a score of 5 is a direct match. We have found a from address left and a from address left in both databases. The next score down is a constant value, and that might be a field such as the municipal name or the province, for instance. Those fields likely might not be in your data model, but there's something that's easily computed through an ETL, so they're just considered to be pretty well fine. The scores go down in value whenever we get to things like there might be a possible match from multiple fields. So you may have concatenated a street name, its direction, and it's maybe here in Hamilton, we've got James Street North and James Street South. So those might have been concatenated. So you might need a process to unpack that data to put it into the various fields that Nina's looking at. And others might be other processes and procedures that are required that you might have to put in place for an ETL. You might have different formatting. You'll have things like, for instance, all caps are not allowed in the NINA model, things like that. And then the lowest score that you'll get on your field-to-field match is that we just didn't find it in the table in the data that we provided. So that data may exist, or that field may exist in other data sets, or it might be something that the municipality would have to go out and create to add it to the data set. So the deliverable coming out of that is that spreadsheet of those field-to-field comparisons and corresponding scores. And then as well, that image on the bottom right is a scorecard that we average out the scores to give you a graphical representation of how well the match or the comparison between the NINA data model specification and your data model works. So you're getting both a low-level technology level set of comparisons, as well as a high-level executive overview of summary of the results of that analysis. The other data evaluation component is the assessment of the data itself. So naturally, we do a walk through the database looking for errors and omissions, such as attribute values. It's not uncommon to find street segments with no name on them, street addresses with null values in them, null itself. So we'll run into things like that, missing addresses and those types of things. So those are pretty standard processes that we look for to evaluate the data. We look for missing features. So you might have a missing road or that isn't in the database for one reason or another. It might have just been overlooked. And then we also look for what we started to call orphan data. And that's data that's not part of the municipality's mandate for collecting information, for instance, for road network, but it is definitely data that's highly desirable by the emergency people. And the example is in the bottom left. This is a view of Kingston, and those of you who are familiar with Kingston, Ontario, it's in the Thousand Islands, or it's on the Thousand Islands, or at the entrance to the Thousand Islands. And there's lots of recreational services provided, or recreational operators. And what you're looking at there is a trailer park. It's all on private land, so those roads are unassumed roads by the municipality, so they're not in the planning database. The owner or operator of that facility has created addresses, house numbers or lot numbers, campsite numbers, as well as named the streets. And so if an accident or emergency happens on one of those streets, the caller will be talking about it from that context. And so it's important that that information be in the database. But it's orphan data. So this is an information management exercise as well as a corporate decision to be made as to how to get that data into the database, which department is going to stand up to collect that data, and then how it's going to be maintained and how the organization is going to resource it. We also look at topology, the relationships on the parity on the address ranges in a segment. We look for overlaps and gaps in the PSAP or the emergency service boundaries and those types of things. So we don't do an audit of the data. We just look for the standard things so that the organization can get a sense for what to look for and what the scope or the magnitude of the things that they will have to address. And so accompanying that is once again a scorecard for executives to understand that these are the things that were looked at, and here's the relative score of the finding for those particular features that we're looking for. The information management aspect is something that is easy to overlook if you're just thinking of the NINA data specification and the NINA data model. You can clean up the data, or you can make adjustments to make the NINA data model, make your information compatible with the NINA model through ETLs and through other processes. But if your mechanisms are not there to ensure that you can continue to maintain that data and that you can deal with issues in a timely manner, and that your update cycles are the same from one PSAP operation to another, then you haven't got very far in meeting the NG9 requirements. So we look at the information systems side of the of the equation. It's not a systems audit. It's just looking to see whether you're running in an enterprise database, whether you've got access control so that the data is protected, whether it's being backed up, whether you're current on your licensing, on your versions, so that you're using the most recent data. You've got, I think I mentioned audit, so you can check who did what, when. We're also looking at data management from the documentation side and the training side. So if a change is being made to a road network by a new technician, do they have a manual that they can work with to say, here are the processes that you go through, here's how you do a split, here's how you allocate the address ranges on the new split, those types of things. And whether that actually includes references in that SOP, whether you're actually including references that says this data is being used for 911 purposes, and therefore it has a connotation that it's not about taxation, it's not about zoning, it's about making sure that the address is being used for emergency response. The big challenges that we find that an organization has, and this is what Alex Brosseau found in Guelph, was the informal relationships between the resolving issues and doing those updates between the end users, which are the EMS, police, and fire department, and how that issue is resolved. So what's typically happening is the EMS, for instance, police or fire, it doesn't matter which one, their responders find an issue, goofy address, incorrect street name, or something like that. They will report it back to the PSAP management, who will report that issue back to the GIS or the planning department for it to be resolved. In the meantime, that issue that the EMS group has found, they will probably update their local copy of the database. So EMS has an updated set. It's not updated back in the planning department yet, or in the corporate database. Police and fire don't have that update. They didn't even know that somebody found a problem with the data. So police, fire, and EMS are out of date as those changes are resolved locally. What also happens is those update cycles vary quite a bit between one organization to the other. In some cases, we found that the update cycle for police is up to a year. So if you're in a fast-growing municipality, and the police department is using data that's, in this case, was using data that was a year old. Fire, we're doing quarterly updates, and then EMS, we're doing updates, or the Ministry of Health is doing updates as their workload allowed them to do. So the data used by those three responders is different, and that is reflected in in the issues that they're finding. The Guelph EMS captain, he just said, when in doubt, we just follow the big red truck, because the fire department will monitor the call to EMS, and if there's a confusion in the address or the location, they will dispatch, and they'll just say, follow us to the location. So information management, update cycles, issue resolution are very, very important to making sure that that data is usable by everyone, and everyone is benefiting from the same way of the work that's being done to maintain the data. And so there's a scoring applied to each one of those. So once again, there's a scorecard produced, as well as a list of the findings that the challenges that are identified and possible recommendations for the organization. Finally, through that whole process, we look at try to evaluate how well the corporation is basically supporting the concept of 911, whether they understand what NG911 means to them, and whether they've built plans or have designated individuals or a committee to deal with the changes and the disruption that NG911 is bringing to them. So we have the categories there of governance, leadership, priorities, workforce, and budget, which is really just resources. Are you going to give resources to do this, or are you going to try to do it off the side of your desk? And whether you're collaborating. So you also have to, there's going to be new models needed to be implemented to talk about how police and fire, what they're finding in their data that they're using against the data that's being produced by the data creators. So that whole activity is is uh, is reported on. That whole readiness assessment is reported on those deliverables that you see, as well as a list of challenges in each one of the categories with recommendations, so the organization can then start to work on a plan to deal with the issues and develop priorities for which one they're going to try to address first. That in mind, I think it's time to pass the torch to Dave for Dave to carry on the presentation.
Excellent. Thanks, Barry. Great coverage of the readiness assessment. So thank you. Okay, so where to go from here? What you see on the screen here is a statement from ESWIG and really speaks to the urgency of what we're talking about. Stakeholder engagement, technical and operational needs assessments, funding and coordinated planning must start now. And certainly from our collective Canadian GIS community perspective, GIS readiness is a big part of this and really need to ensure we start taking action as soon as possible on this. So really the message is don't delay. There are going to be lengthy procurement processes possible. The transition will take time, but certainly when you're looking at readiness and getting your data ready and whatnot, resource competition will start heating up closer we get to the cutoff. So the time to act is now. I just wanted to let you know that we have created a new landing page for you to get more information on the readiness assessment program. The English and French links are there on the bottom of the slide, and you can also get to it via our NG911 landing page at esri/NG911. And we certainly, we're currently working on an online tool for data providers to see how close their data is to NG911 data model. The tool will translate your data to the NINA GIS data standard and map and validate attributes against that standard. We're also looking at providing some best practices for data management and workflows. It is on schedule to be available this quarter, so keep checking our NG911 page for news on that, and that will be a free service for some of the basic data. So we hope you enjoyed today's webinar and were inspired to start thinking about what Next Generation 911 means for you. Esri Canada, together with NINA and the Emergency Services Working Group, look forward to working with you on going forward. Really working together, combining our collective intelligence and energy, we can ensure that the Canadian GIS community is ready for Next Generation 911. So with that, we're going to start looking at questions. And there's quite a few in the list here. So if we don't get to yours, we've got basically 11 minutes remaining here. So we'll try and get to as many as we can here. So starting at the top, has the data model and schema been released yet? So the data model and schema is available. Right now, there's a couple of groups within ESWIG and NINA that are working together to what we call Canadianize the NINA GIS data model, and that's going to be a lengthy process. It's nearly complete in terms of being able to at least do some QA/QC on your data. But there are a few changes in zip code to postal code and some other domain values that are Canadian and French specific. So we are working with NINA to Canadianize that, and like I said, it's going to be made available probably until the end of the year as a complete Canadian model. And that's always a work in progress, anyways. So that's the answer to that. Hopefully, that's understood. Next one, let me just scroll down here. Canada will not be ready for geodetic routing for at least a couple of years. Are there any states in the US using geodetic routing and device-based location data? Yeah, and there's a company called Rapid SOS, which we're talking to here in Canada as well, about providing some enhanced location data for wireless calls coming into 911. And so, but yeah, to answer the question specifically, there are quite a few states that are running that process right now. In your experience working with municipalities, in which department does address creation, assignment, data updates, correction, etc. take place? Is it more often with planning department function or a GIS department function? Barry, do you want to take that one on?
Yep. Thanks, Dave. So typically the responsibility through Provincial Planning Act will delegate the authority to the municipality to assign road names where the geography is organized. And inside that municipality, it is typically the maintenance of the address or the approval of an address on a change has been delegated to the planning department. So the GIS are typically, if there's a central GIS group, it's usually acts as a custodian, a center of excellence to provide expertise, that type of stuff, or they might be providing a GIS service to the planning department, but it is the planning department that typically has the responsibility.
Excellent. Thanks, Barry. So another question here, what is a provisioning boundary? Great question. I didn't cover that when I was talking about the required layers. So the provisioning boundary is really a boundary that identifies the GIS data authority that provided that content to 911. And it's necessary because there's a whole set of discrepancy reporting as you go through the Q&A process of getting the data into NG911, checks and balances, making sure that there's consistency across the entire country, et cetera, et cetera. As you go through that Q&A process, if there is a discrepancy, that provisioning boundary basically identifies who's next to ring, for lack of a better way of explaining it, who's responsible for making the change and editing that data and making it right. So yeah, that's essentially it. Barry, you have anything else to add on that one?
No, but not specifically, but maybe I'll just say that you have the concept of a provisioning boundary, and then underneath that are emergency service areas or boundaries, and those are typically the response areas of the fire department, police, and EMS. So those boundaries may cross a municipal boundary. Here in Ontario, the responsibility for providing EMS services is at the regional level, not at the municipal level. So so even though you have multiple municipalities possibly as individual provisioning agencies, the response area is the or the PSAP area is a different layer, a different polygon layer of information.
Excellent. Thanks, Barry.
Yep.
This one is probably another one maybe you can jump on. If municipal addresses are entered into the system at a non-registered phase, in brackets planning phase, does that negate the need for 72-hour update cycles? Well, let me jump on that first, and you can follow up. So the need for 72-hour update cycles, again, it's a lofty goal, it's an aspirational goal, it's not an absolute requirement, but that's what we're shooting for. But Barry, you can take it from there.
Yep. So so yeah, the process that typically follows is a developer or an individual property holder might want to do a severance, or they might want to make a change, or even the organization, the municipality themselves, may want to change a street name after a famous citizen that's they just want to honor them by changing a street name. So those changes go through an approval process that's usually led by the planning department. If there, this is one of those information management things. So if there's a plan of subdivision that comes in that's going through the approval process, and even before that road is assumed, that private road that's being private construction road is still desired by the fire department and the police department, because there's workers there, there's people there that can get hurt. So it's not hard and fast as to say that the data has to be approved and assumed by the municipality before it gets propagated through the NG911 system. If the data exists, we have to examine the information management processes that would take that data that's being reviewed and being put into the system in a review stage, and possibly getting it out to the emergency response people. So there's a bit of a moving target, or a bit of spaghetti in there that has to be resolved to make sure that even though the road might not be assumed by the municipality, it's in the system.
Excellent. Thanks, Barry.
Okay.
Let's just see here. A lot about whether or not the presentation will be available for replay. Yes, we have recorded this, so that just takes care of about 5 or 6 of similar questions. It's a good question, though. Is the NG911 address management app free? Ooh, you know what? I'm not really one for licensing, so I actually don't even know the answer to that question. Barry, do you know if the address map management app is? I think it's a premium service, isn't it? Yes,
it's a fee-based thing. Yeah. And I don't know the pricing of it. I think it's a sliding scale based on the size of the municipality. I believe that's how it's being structured. So there's another question here as to which version of the NG data model is being used in the assessments. And there was a US version that's now being extended to include Canadian components of it. So you've got things like state versus province, zip code versus postal code, bilingual, that type of thing. So there's a version of that GIS data model that's published. There's a link for it, and that's the one that we're using. Originally, we just said, oh, okay, well, it's obvious that if the zip code means a postal code, so there's a one-to-one match there. You're meeting the data model itself. But now now there's a Canadianized version that's going through the final process, not a Canadian extension that's going through the final process of approval for use in Canada. So that's the one that we're using.
Excellent. Thanks, Barry. So another one that was covered in the presentation, but just to cover it off, will there be a Canadian specific NINA standard with Canadian terminology? So yes. Yeah, that's essentially what they're working on in Canadianizing the current NINA GIS data model. So it will be one data model for essentially North America. It'll take into consideration obviously the US requirements, but also Canadian requirements as well. So that Canadian terminology will exist within that data model. Let's see what else we got. We got basically 1 more minute left. Sorry, just trying to find one that we haven't answered. Dave, there's some ones about the BC situation of
oh
yeah, here I see it right now.
Between
Yeah, so should we be contacting our local 911 providers for more detailed requirements for transitioning to next generation 911, for example, Ecom 911 in Vancouver? Have you worked with any local govs in BC? So Well, you're in good hands with Ecom 911. Rob Darts is the GIS manager there, and he's actually the chair of the main TIF 92, which is a task identification forum within EastWig that's specifically looking at the mapping and GIS considerations for next generation 911. So you're in very good hands there. And if you're asking about have you worked with any local govs in BC, or if you're talking about doing readiness assessments specifically, not yet, but we've had many discussions through the ICI Society, essentially on an education side of getting ready for next generation 911 GIS. So with that, any other questions that we haven't answered, we'll try and get to and respond directly back to the individual asking. But again, thank you very much for your participation. Some great questions as well today. Have yourself a great rest of your day. Be safe out there, be healthy. Thanks again for participating.
Thank you. Take care, people.